Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar, we're going to focus on the module academics with an emphasis, and we're going to spotlight just one of the pathways from this module, reading instruction with an emphasis on secondary. My name is Michelle Lambert-Yuhasz, and I'm part of the tier team here at the University of Texas in Austin. My special guest and colleague is Dr. Phil Capin, and he is also at the University of Texas in Austin. Before I turn it over to him, let's just revisit what our network is all about, as well as get a gist of what this overall module is. So, as you recall, we're one of the 9 technical assistant networks funded by the Texas Education Agency, previously referred to as intervention best practices. However, please look at the top of this slide, and what we have done is we renamed our network, and we renamed it to Tiered Interventions Using Evidence-Based Research, or TIER for short. TIER is designed to provide a comprehensive and coherent plan for intervention best practices across the state of Texas, supporting the local education agencies and the schools that are part of them. And we have done this by collaborating with experts from the Texas Regional Service Centers, as well as school districts, and as well as universities across the country, and some national technical assistance centers. What we've done is we collaborated with them to develop professional learning content and resources. They're organized within 10 different modules, as you can see here on the screen. I'll take a moment so you can see the 10 modules that are being made available to you. Okay. So just know that each of these 10 modules contain a set of materials, and these materials are presentations, handouts, videos, and other resources. This is there to support the professional learning for your stakeholders or you personally. So just know that these modules and all their accompanying resources will be available on the website once it is launched. So keep visiting back to see as we keep building our website. Now just know that each one of these 10 modules are designed to comprehensively meet the needs of your stakeholders. Now you can take each one of these modules in its entirety. So if you were to pull out a module and take the whole module as a whole, it would take anywhere from 3 to 20 hours, depending on the content. However, we've also designed it that you can choose your own adventure, meaning that you can choose one of the pathways or the individual presentations that are housed in that particular module. For example, today, as you see here with the arrow, we're going to be focusing on the module academics. This particular module, as you see, encompasses 9 individual pathways, or 9 choose your own adventures. So either you can take this whole module as a whole, which would probably take you about 20 hours to take the whole thing, or you can choose one or several of these pathways to explore or to provide as professional learning opportunities for your stakeholders. With this particular module, this module as a whole focuses on academic instruction within MTSS. It focuses on using evidence-based, scientifically researched, explicit instructional practices to support the high-quality instructional delivery and the academic support of all students in the grades of kindergarten through 12th grade in tiers 1, 2, and 3. This module encompasses instruction and support in the areas of reading with elementary and secondary, writing, elementary and secondary, mathematics, elementary and secondary, science, social studies, and then we have a pathway that focuses on explicit instruction. Now within all of these pathways, it integrates the implementation of culturally and linguistically responsive practices within each one of them. So the goal of this module is to assist educators in all content areas in order to better meet the instructional needs of all students. This ensures success and high achievement for all of our students. So without further ado, I want to formally introduce my colleague, Dr. Phil Capin. He is a researcher that focuses on identifying effective instructional practices for students who may be at risk for learning difficulties. He also serves as an investigator or a project director at the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk within the University of Texas at Austin on various projects. He is an expert in this particular area, and I do appreciate him collaborating with us on this particular pathway, reading with a secondary emphasis. He's going to be spotlighting this pathway, and I guarantee you, after you see his spotlight, you're going to want to visit the whole pathway. So without further ado, take it away, Dr. Capin.
Thank you, Michelle. Yes, I'm going to briefly highlight the key elements of a presentation developed to support adolescent literacy, particularly for students with reading difficulties. So let's start with our why. Why is secondary literacy important? Well, we know an inability to effectively read for understanding is an impediment to K-12 school performance, post-secondary school learning, and success in an increasingly competitive and knowledge-based work environment. Many of the jobs that were available in decades past that required few literacy skills are no longer available today. Thus, the ability to read and comprehend text matters now more than ever. Unfortunately, we also know many students have deficits in the area of reading by the time they enter the secondary grades, and expectations for reading increase significantly as students enter and progress through the secondary grades. Specifically, secondary students are expected to read a variety of text types that contain lots of academic vocabulary and conceptually dense information. Understanding this text requires students to have adequate prior knowledge. For these reasons, it is perhaps unsurprising that about 2/3 of Americans' 8th graders in America perform at or below a basic level in reading. Encouragingly, substantial research has been conducted over the past 30 years to identify evidence-based practices for developing adolescent literacy. The full presentation is based on converging recommendations from several reviews and practice guides. These recommendations call for explicit vocabulary and comprehension strategy instruction, frequent opportunities for students to read and engage in text-based activities, intensive interventions for struggling readers that attend to their decoding and fluency difficulties, and approaches that support students' motivation and engagement. These recommendations from these previous research reviews reflect the empirical basis for this module. Okay, so this slide presents the key objectives of the full presentation. There's 3 of them. The first is the presentation identifies evidence-based reading practices for instructional content and delivery for each instructional tier. What do we mean by instructional content and delivery? So instructional content refers to the reading practices that are evidence-based, and instructional delivery refers to how these practices can be effectively taught to students. The second objective of the presentation is to describe the ways instruction can be intensified for students who have underdeveloped reading proficiency. Lastly, because previous research has shown that it is difficult to meaningfully close the gap for struggling adolescent readers, this presentation offers up 5 potential pressure points that I think have the power to meaningfully improve adolescent literacy. In today's brief presentation, I'm going to preview how each of these objectives will be addressed in the full presentation. Okay, so let's get started. We'll start with evidence-based practices for Tier 1 reading instruction. So for the goals of Tier 1 instruction, the TEKS specify that secondary students should be able to read, comprehend, and learn content from grade-level texts. So the goal of Tier 1 is to provide high-quality instruction that supports both the development of reading comprehension and content knowledge acquisition. Our goal for Tier 1 assessment is to quickly identify students who require supplemental reading interventions. In the secondary grades, it is not typically necessary to administer additional reading assessments. We already know a lot about students by the time they enter the secondary grades. So I encourage teachers to make use of state testing and other reliable reading assessments collected by campuses to identify students who need additional Tier 2 and Tier 3 support. Although sometimes people will consider Tier 1 with general education, it's important to remember that 60% of secondary students with disabilities spend a majority of their day in content area settings. So what happens in Tier 1 has big consequences for all students, including those with disabilities. So how can we support reading development and content acquisition in Tier 1? Well, adolescent reading research recommends integrating vocabulary and comprehension instruction as the primary means to enhancing adolescent literacy in Tier 1 content area classes. So why might it be important to integrate vocabulary and comprehension within content area learning? Well, there's a few reasons. For one, there are reciprocal benefits to integrating vocabulary comprehension in content area teaching. We know that students who have strong vocabulary and comprehension are better able to understand content area texts. Conversely, we also know that developing knowledge supports reading comprehension, as it's difficult to understand text without relevant background knowledge. So vocabulary and comprehension improve content area understanding, and the opposite is true, that content area understanding improves vocabulary and comprehension. This integration is perhaps most important for students who are not proficient in reading, as it provides them better access to the content area learning. However, these practices, the practices being explicit vocabulary instruction and reading comprehension strategy instruction, benefit higher performing students as well. So how should vocabulary and comprehension be taught? Currently, the approaches with the most evidence are explicit vocabulary instructional routines and comprehension strategy instruction. Let me show you what these look like. So here, I'm going to preview the approach to explicit vocabulary instruction that we describe in greater detail in the full presentation. This slide shows a vocabulary graphic organizer that can be used to teach vocabulary following an explicit instructional routine. You can see this graphic organizer includes several elements. You can see the graphic organizer includes the vocabulary word in English and Spanish, a student-friendly explanation of the word, synonyms and related words, an illustration of the word, example sentences, and an opportunity for students to practice using the vocabulary word in context using a turn and talk procedure. In the full presentation, we describe how teachers can effectively use this graphic organizer to support comprehension and content learning. To address comprehension, we encourage teachers to identify 2 reading comprehension strategies that can be used to support reading comprehension, because research suggests that multiple comprehension strategies is beneficial. Teaching multiple reading comprehension strategies is beneficial, as opposed to just teaching a single strategy. So we don't, in the full presentation, indicate which are the best reading comprehension strategies to use, because the research is not clear on that. However, to make it concrete for teachers, the full presentation focuses on 2 strategies. It does identify 2 strategies, asking and answering questions and identifying main ideas. And it walks the teachers or the participants through step by step how they could teach their children to independently use these strategies. Okay, so we talked about explicit instruction, explicit vocabulary instruction with graphic organizers, and reading comprehension strategies as the 2 approaches to adolescent literacy in Tier 1. Now that we've discussed Tier 1, we're going to transition to Tiers 2 and 3. Tier 2 and Tier 3 reading interventions are provided to struggling students who are not making adequate progress in the general education classroom. The primary goal of these interventions is to accelerate reading growth for students identified with reading difficulties. By the middle grades, struggling readers may be significantly behind their peers. For instance, a 7th grader may be performing at closer to a 4th or 5th grade level. So interventions that produce more than 1 year's worth of reading growth in a single academic year are necessary. Another important component of Tiers 2 and 3 relates to assessment. As we discussed in the context of Tier 1 assessment, we encourage schools to use data that are collected school-wide for the purposes of initial screening and determining intervention intensity. For progress monitoring, I encourage teachers to use measures that can inform how well interventions are working and the instructional changes that may be necessary to improve student learning. State tests provide a pretty good indication of how students fare relative to their peers. So this assessment should really focus on answering 2 questions. Assessment for students in Tiers 2 and 3 should focus on addressing 2 questions. Is the child responding to the instruction I am providing, and how could I modify my instruction to improve student learning? So let's talk about some of the features of effective Tier 2 reading instruction. So the curriculum, it's important to have an evidence-based reading program that includes some of these instructional elements, such as multi-syllable word recognition, fluency, vocabulary, and reading comprehension. Remember that Tier 2 is offered as a supplement to Tier 1 and provides a different curriculum tailored to students' needs, rather than a reteach of the same curriculum or instruction used in Tier 1. For grouping, there's not a strong research base to determine the optimal group size for secondary students, but we know that students benefit from smaller group sizes that allow them more opportunities to practice and receive feedback. So many schools are adopting medium-sized groups of about 10 to 12 students for Tier 2 interventions in the secondary grades. In terms of instructional time, you can think of 30 to 50 minutes per day for a school year. Oftentimes, it'll be one class session a day, so that would be closer to 50 minutes. In terms of assessment, diagnostic assessments help to determine the instructional needs and pacing of instruction. For instance, do students have foundational word reading deficits that require remediation, or do they primarily need support in vocabulary comprehension and knowledge building to support comprehension? Progress monitoring is used to determine how well students are responding to instruction, and this may be implemented for students in Tier 2 about every 6 weeks. For curriculum-based measures, these are measures that are intended to inform instructional plans. We want to implement those more frequently. So, for instance, you may implement them every 2 weeks to guide instructional changes. For Tier 3, you might be wondering, how does Tier 3 differ from Tier 2? Well, Tier 3 is more intensive and individualized than Tier 2. So you're still going to want to focus on an evidence-based reading program, but you'll want that evidence-based reading program to incorporate more instruction related to word reading. So instruction related to decoding and fluency may be essential for these students that have the most significant reading difficulties. Past research indicates that students with the most significant needs in these grades, in the middle school grades and high school grades, often have foundational reading problems. A recent study suggested that about 80% of students in the middle school grades have foundational word reading and fluency problems. So it's important that your curriculum focuses on word reading in addition to vocabulary and comprehension. In terms of grouping, we're looking at smaller groups. So you might be thinking of 4 to 5 students. This provides students more opportunities, again, for practice and opportunities to receive feedback from a teacher. Although the optimal group sizes, are not currently known, that's the sort of current recommendation is to, as intensity increases, to reduce group sizes. In terms of instructional time, you're thinking of 1 to 2 hours per day. Here you see a big difference between Tier 2 and Tier 3. These students require intensive and extensive daily instruction in order to make meaningful progress in reading and fully access content learning. Related to assessment, diagnostic assessments are still needed to determine the focus and pacing of instruction, at least initially. And then progress monitoring assessments and curriculum-based measures can help to answer questions related to, is my student responding, and what instructional changes are required to optimize student learning. Okay, so as you can see, the instructional content changes across instructional tiers. In Tier 1, we have vocabulary and reading comprehension as the primary foci. In Tiers 2 and 3, you start to address reading fluency and word reading development. And specifically in Tier 3, there's this need for foundational word reading support. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this will, of course, vary by student. But I think this framework of thinking about instructional content across tiers, it can be helpful. What you can also see in this figure is the arrow below the table indicates that intensity of instructional delivery should also increase as students move from Tier 1 to Tier 3. Although all students will benefit from explicit instructional approaches, students in Tier 3, for instance, including those students with disabilities, will require the most intensive instructional delivery. So what might that entail? Repeated modeling, lots of opportunities for guided practice, additional opportunities for practice with feedback, and other features of instructional delivery that are critical for students with disabilities. Here's an overview of how I suggest reading assessments may vary by instructional tier. You see that we list universal screeners for Tier 1. It's important that we examine data for all students at the start of the school year to identify students who require Tier 2 or Tier 3 instruction. However, as we previously mentioned, we suggest that schools use existing data whenever possible. You can also see diagnostic assessments, curriculum-based measures, and formal progress monitoring measures are important in Tiers 2 and 3. And you can see how these might vary across tiers. Okay, so we just talked a little bit about how instruction can be intensified across instructional tiers. In the full presentation, I try to make this more concrete for participants by leading an interactive activity in which teachers or participants really, are presented a sample Tier 1 lesson and asked how this instruction could be intensified for Tiers 2 and 3. Let me show you what this activity looks like. So the handout here shows the sample Tier 1 lesson that we provide to participants. You may not be able to see the text well, but the participants will receive these lessons as handouts. The sample lesson is focused on comprehension with a narrative text. In this activity, we ask teachers to read the sample lesson for Tier 1, work with a partner to answer some study questions related to how the lesson could be intensified for Tier 2, and then participants are given the opportunity to share out their responses. From there, we show them a lesson that we've developed that's modified for Tier 2. Again, you may not be able to see it on the slide, but there's modifications are shown in bold. And then the lesson is also annotated. So in the margins, it explains to teachers how the lessons have been modified. So for instance, for Tier 2, a learning objective related to reading fluency was added. There's more opportunities for students to practice. Teachers offer additional scaffolding to support student strategy use. From there, after they've had a chance to review the changes in Tier 2, they meet again with a partner and consider study questions related to intensifying instruction further for Tier 3. And then finally, after they've had a chance to respond to the study questions, we share with participants the sample lesson for Tier 3 and provide them concrete examples of ways instructional content and delivery are modified to support students with significant reading difficulties. Okay, the last element of the presentation that I want to highlight today relates to potential pressure points for advancing secondary literacy. We consider these pressure points because these simple recommendations have the potential for significant improvement in secondary literacy growth, just as applying a little force to a pressure point can have a significant impact throughout the body. The pressure points were inspired by a talk that my colleague, Dr. Sharon Vaughn, provided a couple years ago, in which she talked about how previous research indicates that there's an urgent need for us to consider novel ways to improve adolescent literacy. As many of us experience, past research shows that there's a lot of room for improvement when it comes to secondary literacy. According to national data, almost 90% of students with disability perform at or below a basic level in reading. Also, research reviews indicate that reading interventions for students in the secondary grades have, on average, led to smaller gains than interventions for students in the elementary grades. So given this need to greatly improve the literacy skills of secondary students, particularly those with disabilities, the presentation outlines 5 pressure points that I think have the potential to really move the needle when it comes to secondary literacy. In the full presentation, they're embedded throughout the presentation, but here I'll walk you through them quickly. So here's the first pressure point. I recommend that schools adopt evidence-based approaches to enhancing vocabulary and comprehension that can be used in all classes and tiers of instruction. So this is really a school-wide recommendation for utilizing the practices that we discussed earlier related to explicit vocabulary instruction and reading comprehension strategies. There are several benefits to adopting school-wide approaches, but the main benefit may be that students have more opportunities to practice and learn strategies if common approaches are used across classes within grades and across grades. Given that we know Tier 2 and Tier 3 reading interventions alone are beneficial, but typically unable to close the gap for students who are not meeting basic levels of proficiency, and that most students with difficulties receive a majority of their instruction in Tier 1, it is critical that all classes use evidence-based practices and may be beneficial if these practices are aligned. The second pressure point is a suggestion that students practice reading for understanding in every class every day. So previous research indicates that secondary content area students are not frequently asked to read extended text during instruction in social studies and science. Instead, key points are summarized for students in PowerPoint lectures or condensed into brief study guides. Limiting students' exposure to text and opportunities to practice comprehending text is problematic in the short and long term. In the short term, we sacrifice exposure to important content and vocabulary when we circumvent the use of text. Additionally, we do not prepare students for the reading tasks that will be found on state assessments. In the long term, limiting students' exposure to text and literacy instruction may leave them unprepared for literacy demands required in the workplace and post-secondary education. We're not suggesting that every minute of every lesson be text-based. We know there are times during secondary instruction when a text may not be the primary vehicle for teaching content. However, we do suggest that text reading plays a significant role in instruction across content areas and instructional tiers. The third pressure point relates to aligning instruction across instructional tiers to maximize student response. So we talked about how practices for targeting multi-syllable word reading and reading fluency in Tier 2 interventions may be beneficial. Okay, pressure point 4. So this pressure point is focused on struggling readers and the importance of developing foundational word reading skills among these students. So although we know comprehension is the ultimate goal of reading for all students, we also know that students cannot access text and comprehend text if they cannot read words with automaticity. So therefore, we recommend explicit, systematic word reading instruction for those students who have really the most intractable reading difficulties. We've in my own experience as a teacher and in observing instruction, I often see students with really significant word reading deficits who are not receiving instruction or adequate instruction in this area, especially in the secondary grades. So I think this is an important catalyst for improving adolescent literacy. The last pressure point is another important consideration when designing and delivering intensive interventions. So in addition to incorporating foundational word reading instruction, we also think it's crucial that intensive interventions focus on developing knowledge. Although it is not easy, it is important that intensive interventions try to focus on both word and world knowledge. Students need knowledge of the world to read with understanding and connect ideas that are not explicitly stated in text. Teaching struggling readers strategies is helpful, but if students don't have prior knowledge of certain topics, no reading strategy will help them to make sense of it. For example, consider reading a paragraph about aviation if you do not know anything about flying planes. You can't strategize your way to comprehension if you don't have adequate background knowledge. So the bottom line is that comprehension requires prior knowledge. Therefore, it is necessary to build students' reading skills within the context of knowledge building instruction. What can teachers do? Teach reading using texts of various genres that teach important content, or at least something within the state standards related to science, history, art, economics. It's really important to develop knowledge and not neglect it when focusing on developing reading strategies and skills. And this is for students across tiers, but even for our students with our most persistent reading difficulties. These students need, skill development, but they also need knowledge building. Okay, well, I hope this provides you some insight into what the secondary literacy module will entail, and I hope you will check it out once it's available. I think that's back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Dr. Capin. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And ladies and gentlemen, please keep revisiting our website to see all the great resources that are on there and visit this pathway in its entirety. and check out the whole module of academics. Be sure to visit with us next week as we move on and showcase the next module, which is screening. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.